The gavel echoes through the packed small claims courtroom as Judge Brantley Thornfield leans forward, his weathered face twisted into a sneer of disgust. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the worn wooden benches where dozens of onlookers sit in uncomfortable silence, watching what they believe will be another routine case of fraud. So let me get this straight. The judge's voice drips with condescension as he shuffles through papers with theatrical disgust. You're telling this court that, Madame, he pauses, holding up air quotes with mock reverence, Serafina here actually convinced you she could speak to your deceased husband? And you're seriously asking me to award you $8,500 because her crystal ball readings didn't bring him back from the dead? The courtroom erupts in scattered laughter, but there's an edge to it. Uncomfortable, nervous energy that suggests everyone knows they're witnessing something more than simple entertainment. In the defendant's chair sits Blake Westbrook, a 42-year-old black woman whose presence seems to command attention despite her modest appearance. She wears a simple purple head wrap adorned with subtle silver threads, modest jewelry that catches the light just enough to suggest quality without ostentation. Her dark eyes remain steady, unflinching, as the judge's contempt washes over her like water off stone. Ma'am, I've seen plenty of con artists come through this courtroom, Thornfield continues, his voice rising with each word. But using grief to prey on vulnerable widows, that's a special kind of low. Even for, he gestures dismissively toward Blake, leaving the implication hanging in the air like smoke. Your people. A manila folder rustles almost inaudibly as Blake carefully places it on the defendant's table. The movement is precise, controlled, and those sitting close enough might catch a glimpse of the document header. Case file 2024-1158, active federal investigation. But the lettering is small and the angle deliberate, visible only to those who know where to look. Your Honor, with respect, Blake's voice cuts through the murmur of the gallery, clear and measured. There are procedures for reviewing evidence before making determinations about procedures. Thornfield's interruption comes like a slap. You think I'm going to listen to procedures from someone who claims she talks to dead people for a living? This whole charade ends now. But as Blake's fingers tap twice against the folder's edge, a movement so subtle it might be mistaken for nervousness, something in her posture shifts. It's barely perceptible, like a coiled spring waiting for the precise moment to release, or a chess master who has just seen the endgame 20 moves ahead. The lock clicks twice, then silence. 3 hours earlier, Blake had arrived at the courthouse in a modest Honda Civic, the kind of vehicle that blends into any parking lot without attracting attention. She'd chosen spot number 17 deliberately, close enough to the main entrance for quick access, far enough from the security cameras to avoid detailed surveillance footage. Old habits from a life most people in this building would never imagine. As she gathered her documents from the passenger seat, each paper was arranged in precise stacks. Legal briefs on the bottom, witness statements in the middle, a single manila folder on top marked with federal classifications that would mean nothing to casual observers. The organization wasn't accidental. Every document had its place, every piece of evidence cataloged with the kind of systematic approach that spoke of years of training most people would never recognize. The courthouse lobby buzzed with the typical Monday morning chaos. Lawyers wheeling briefcases rushed between elevators. Families clustered around information desks looking lost. And court clerks moved with the tired efficiency of people who'd seen it all before. Blake approached the main desk, where a middle-aged woman with reading glasses perched on her nose barely looked up from her computer screen. I need to review the case file for Whitmore versus Mercier, Blake said, using the alias she'd maintained for 18 months. The court clerk's eyes flicked up briefly, taking in the purple head wrap, the modest clothing, the manila folder that looked distinctly out of place among the typical small claims paperwork. You got representation? The clerk asked, her tone suggesting she already knew the answer and wasn't particularly interested in providing help. I'm representing myself. PROSA defendants don't get file access until discovery. You can request copies through your case number, but that'll take 3 to 5 business days. The dismissal was swift, professional, and carried the weight of bureaucratic authority that most people accepted without question. Blake nodded politely, but her eyes had already completed a systematic survey of the lobby. Security camera positions, northeast corner by the metal detectors, southwest corner overlooking the information desk, central coverage from the elevated security booth. Exit routes, main entrance, emergency stairs on the east wing, service elevator requiring keycard access, guard stations, 2 armed security officers at the main entrance, 1 roving patrol, and a supervisor in the elevated booth who seemed more interested in his smartphone than actual security. What happens next will completely shatter everything you think you know about this case. This woman's true identity is so shocking that when the judge discovers who he's been mocking, his entire world will collapse. But first, you need to see how deep this deception really goes. Hit that subscribe button because this story takes a turn that no one, and I mean no one, could possibly predict. The elevator to the third floor carried a mix of nervous defendants and confident attorneys. Blake stood quietly in the corner, observing the dynamics with the kind of trained awareness most people never develop. The young man in the expensive suit was definitely a prosecutor. His briefcase bore the telltale scratches from courthouse security screenings, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who wins more cases than he loses. The elderly woman clutching a folder of medical bills was clearly representing herself in a personal injury case, her hands shaking slightly with the nervous energy of someone about to face a system she didn't understand. When the elevator dinged at the third floor, Blake stepped out into the corridor leading to courtroom 3A. The hallway walls were lined with wooden benches where witnesses and families waited, their conversations creating a low buzz of anxiety and anticipation. At the far end, near the courtroom entrance, she noticed a man in his 50s wearing a bailiff's uniform. Reed Ashford, according to the badge visible on his chest, carried himself with the swagger of someone who enjoyed the authority his position provided. Blake took a seat on one of the benches, positioning herself where she could observe both the courtroom entrance and the witness waiting area. From her briefcase, she withdrew a small notebook. Nothing fancy, just a standard spiral-bound pad that anyone might use for taking notes. But her handwriting revealed something most observers would miss: the precise, systematic notation style taught in federal law enforcement training. Each observation was documented with timestamps, location references, and behavioral analysis that went far beyond casual note-taking. 9:45 a.m. Bailiff Ashford demonstrates dismissive body language toward Hispanic family waiting for hearing, pattern consistent with unconscious bias training scenarios. 9:52 a.m. Court reporter Williams arrives 7 minutes late, appears overwhelmed by case backlog. Potential ally if approached correctly. 9:58 a.m. Plaintiff's attorney Ridge Hawthorne enters with briefcase bearing logos from 3 different law firms, either recent transfer or handles overflow cases. Confidence level suggests familiarity with local court procedures. The courtroom doors opened precisely at 10 o'clock a.m., and the morning's cases began with the mechanical efficiency of an assembly line. Blake watched 3 separate proceedings before her case was called, noting the subtle patterns that would be invisible to most observers. Judge Thornfield treated white defendants with professional courtesy, asking clarifying questions and ensuring they understood their rights. Hispanic and black defendants received terse instructions and impatient sighs when they asked for explanations. Speaking of hidden identities and surveillance, protecting your personal information online has never been more critical. NordVPN encrypts your internet connection and hides your digital identity from prying eyes, just like our protagonist is hiding her true role. With military-grade encryption and servers in over 60 countries, NordVPN ensures your online activities remain completely private. Get 73% off your subscription plus 4 additional months free when you visit nordvpn.com/truecrime. That's nordvpn.com/truecrime for maximum digital protection. Case number 24-1567, the court clerk announced. Whitmore versus Mercier. Civil complaint for damages related to fraudulent spiritual counseling services. As Blake rose from her seat in the gallery and walked toward the defendant's table, she could feel the weight of dozens of eyes following her movement. The purple headwrap and modest jewelry created exactly the impression she'd cultivated over 18 months of undercover work. A woman who claimed spiritual powers. Someone easy to dismiss and even easier to underestimate. Cordelia Whitmore, the plaintiff, sat at the opposing table with her attorney Ridge Hawthorne. Whitmore was a woman in her early 60s, her gray hair perfectly styled and her black dress suggesting both mourning and affluence. Her eyes followed Blake with a mixture of anger and pain that spoke to genuine grief, whatever the truth behind her claims might be. Hawthorne himself was exactly what Blake had expected from her preliminary research. Mid-40s, expensive suit that had seen better days, and the kind of confidence that came from handling dozens of similar cases. His briefcase bore scratches from courthouse security screenings, and his familiarity with the court staff suggested he was a regular presence in these proceedings. "Your Honor," Hawthorne began as soon as everyone was seated, "my client, Mrs. Whitmore, trusted the defendant with her most precious memories of her late husband. Instead of legitimate counseling, she received what can only be described as psychological manipulation designed to extract maximum financial gain from her grief." Judge Thornfield nodded approvingly, his earlier hostility toward Blake apparently extending to a presumption of guilt. "Mrs. Whitmore, tell the court in your own words what happened." Cordelia Whitmore dabbed at her eyes with a tissue before speaking, her voice trembling with emotion. After my husband passed 6 months ago, I was desperate for any connection to him. A friend recommended Madame Serafina's spiritual counseling services. She gestured toward Blake with a mixture of accusation and hurt. She told me she could help me communicate with Harold, that he had messages for me. And did you pay for these alleged services? Thornfield asked, his tone suggesting he already knew the answer. Over 4 months, I paid her $3,200 for individual sessions and group readings. She told me Harold was concerned about financial decisions I was making, that he wanted me to invest in specific stocks, that he was worried about certain family members. Whitmore's voice rose with each detail. When I started asking questions about how she could know these things, she became evasive and finally stopped returning my calls. Blake listened to the testimony with professional detachment, taking notes that appeared to be defensive strategies but were actually behavioral analysis. Whitmore's testimony showed signs of genuine grief but also contained inconsistencies that suggested possible coaching. The specific mention of financial advice was particularly interesting. It aligned with patterns. Attorney Hawthorne rose from his chair with the practiced confidence of someone who delivered this type of presentation dozens of times before. Your Honor, this case represents a textbook example of predatory spiritual fraud. The defendant specifically targeted my client during her most vulnerable period, used classic psychological manipulation techniques, and extracted significant sums of money under false pretenses. He approached the evidence table with a stack of documents that he spread out with theatrical precision. We have documented evidence of the defendant's claims to supernatural abilities, receipts showing payments totaling $3,200, and witness testimony regarding the emotional distress caused by her fraudulent practices. Blake rose smoothly from her chair, her movement controlled and deliberate. Your Honor, I request the opportunity to review the evidence being presented before the court makes any determinations about its admissibility. The request was perfectly reasonable under civil procedure rules, but Judge Thornfield's response revealed his bias immediately. Mrs. Mercier, this is small claims court, not the Supreme Court. We don't need elaborate procedural delays for what's clearly a straightforward fraud case. With respect, Your Honor, Blake replied, her voice maintaining perfect professional courtesy. Federal Rule of Civil Procedure 26 establishes clear guidelines for evidence review that apply to all civil proceedings, regardless of jurisdiction level. The court reporter's fingers paused over her stenography machine. Janet Williams had been recording proceedings in this courthouse for 12 years, and she'd never heard a pro se defendant cite specific federal procedural rules with such precision. She glanced up at Blake with newfound interest, wondering exactly what kind of background would give someone such detailed knowledge of legal procedure. Judge Thornfield's expression darkened. Mrs. Mercier, I don't know where you think you learned about legal procedure, but citing federal rules in a state small claims proceeding suggests you don't understand the jurisdiction you're actually in. I understand the jurisdiction perfectly, Your Honor. I'm simply noting that procedural fairness requirements apply consistently across all levels of civil litigation. Blake's tone remained respectful, but there was something in her posture, a confidence that went beyond what most people would display when facing judicial hostility. Bailiff Reed Ashford shifted in his position near the courtroom entrance, his hand moving unconsciously toward his radio. Something about this defendant felt different from the usual small claims cases. Most people representing themselves showed clear signs of nervousness or intimidation when facing judicial pressure. This woman seemed completely comfortable with confrontation, almost as if she'd been trained for it. Attorney Hawthorne sensed an opportunity to exploit the judge's obvious irritation. Your Honor, it's clear that the defendant is attempting to use pseudo-legal language to deflect from the simple fact that she defrauded my client. This kind of manipulation is exactly what she used on Mrs. Whitmore. Impressive-sounding claims that fall apart under scrutiny. Mr. Hawthorne raises an excellent point, Thornfield replied, his approval obvious. Mrs. Mercier, unless you can provide actual legal credentials to support your procedural objections, I suggest you focus on defending against the fraud allegations rather than attempting to lecture this court on legal procedure. Blake nodded politely, but those observing closely might notice that her right hand moved briefly to her jacket pocket, a gesture so quick it could have been mistaken for nervousness. In reality, she was checking the position of her federal identification, calculating exactly when and how it would be most effective to reveal her true credentials. The moment wasn't right yet. The opposition needed to commit more fully to their narrative of incompetence and fraud before the revelation would have maximum impact. Mrs. Whitmore, Judge Thornfield continued, tell the court about the specific claims this woman made regarding her supernatural abilities. Cordelia Whitmore straightened in her chair, her grief giving way to righteous anger. She told me she had been communicating with spirits since childhood, that she had special gifts that allowed her to bridge the gap between our world and the next. She said Harold's spirit was restless because I hadn't properly honored his memory, and that only through her guidance could I help him find peace. Blake made careful notes as the testimony continued, but her observations went far beyond simple legal defense. She was documenting behavioral patterns, speech rhythms, and emotional tells that would be invisible to most observers but represented years of training in psychological analysis. She also claimed, Whitmore continued, that Harold was trying to warn me about financial dangers, that certain investments would honor his memory while others would disappoint him. When I asked how she could possibly know about our private financial discussions, she said the spirits revealed all truths to those with proper sensitivity. And did you make financial decisions based on these alleged communications, Hawthorne prompted. Yes. She convinced me to liquidate Harold's life insurance payout and invest in what she called spiritually aligned opportunities. When those investments started failing, and I questioned her advice, she claimed Harold's spirit was testing my faith. Judge Thornfield leaned forward with obvious interest. You're saying the defendant provided specific financial advice under the guise of spiritual communication? Exactly. She used my grief to manipulate my judgment, then profited from both her fraudulent spiritual services and the financial advice that benefited her associates. Blake rose from her chair once more, this time with a subtle shift in her demeanor that suggested steel beneath the modest exterior. Your Honor, I object to the characterization of spiritual counseling as financial advice. Mrs. Whitmore was provided with emotional support during her grieving process, and any investment decisions were made independently based on her own judgment. Objection denied, Thornfield snapped. Mrs. Mercier, you're not qualified to make formal objections in this proceeding, and frankly, your attempt to hide behind legal terminology while defending obvious fraud is exactly the kind of manipulation Mr. Hawthorne described. The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Blake's response would define the trajectory of everything that followed. Your Honor, with respect, I'm not hiding behind legal terminology. I'm citing established precedent regarding the distinction between spiritual counseling and financial advisory services. The court's characterization of my services as fraud requires evidence of intentional deception, which has not been established through witness testimony alone. Bailiff Ashford stepped forward slightly, his hand now resting openly on his radio. Your Honor, should I maintain order in the courtroom? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Blake was being positioned as a disruptive influence, someone whose very presence challenged the court's authority. But instead of backing down, she did something unexpected. She smiled. It wasn't a defiant smile or a mocking gesture. It was the patient expression of someone who understood exactly what was happening and was perfectly prepared for what came next. Bailiff Ashford, she said calmly, I appreciate your concern for courtroom order. However, I believe federal guidelines regarding the treatment of pro se defendants might be relevant to this situation. The specificity of the reference, federal guidelines rather than state rules, treatment protocols rather than general courtesy, suggested knowledge that went far beyond what most people would possess. Court reporter Williams found herself typing more carefully, wondering if she was missing something important. Mrs. Mercier, Judge Thornfield's voice carried a warning. I'm going to ask you one more time to focus on defending against the specific allegations rather than attempting to lecture this court on procedure you clearly don't understand. Blake nodded respectfully, then did something that surprised everyone in the courtroom. She opened the manila folder on her table and withdrew a single sheet of paper. Not a legal brief or witness statement, but what appeared to be a standard printout from a government website. Your Honor, I'd like to submit for the court's review a copy of the courthouse's own posted procedures regarding evidence examination rights for pro se defendants, which I photographed from the bulletin board in the main lobby this morning. The simple act of photographing posted procedures wasn't remarkable in itself, but the fact that she'd thought to do it, and the systematic way she presented the documentation, suggested preparation that went beyond what most people would consider for a small claims case. Attorney Hawthorne sensed his advantage slipping and moved to regain control. Your Honor, the defendant is clearly attempting to overwhelm the court with irrelevant procedural complications to avoid addressing the central issue of fraud. This is exactly the kind of manipulative behavior my client experienced during their sessions. Mr. Hawthorne makes an excellent point, Thornfield agreed, his approval obvious. Mrs. Mercier, I'm ordering you to address the fraud allegations directly rather than continuing these procedural delays. The moment had arrived. The line had been crossed. Judge Thornfield had just denied Blake her basic rights to evidence review. Court reporter Williams was documenting every violation of procedure, and the opposition had committed fully to their narrative of manipulation and incompetence. Blake looked directly at the judge, her expression calm but somehow different, as if a switch had been flipped. Your Honor, I understand the court's concern about procedural efficiency. However, I must note that denial of evidence review rights to pro se defendants may constitute a violation of 42 U.S.C. Section 1983 regarding deprivation of constitutional rights under color of state law. The silence that followed was deafening. Court reporter Williams stopped typing entirely, her hands frozen above the stenography machine. In 12 years of recording courthouse proceedings, she'd never heard a pro se defendant cite specific federal civil rights statutes with such precision. The reference wasn't just accurate, it was the exact legal foundation that federal authorities used when investigating systematic civil rights violations in state court systems. Judge Thornfield's face had gone pale. Mrs. Mercier, are you threatening this court with federal litigation? I'm not threatening anything, Your Honor. I'm simply documenting procedural violations for potential future reference. Blake's voice remained perfectly calm, but something fundamental had shifted in the courtroom dynamics. The denial of evidence review rights, combined with the court's characterization of federal civil rights statutes as threats, creates a pattern that federal oversight agencies find interesting. Attorney Hawthorne shot to his feet. Your Honor, this is exactly what I was describing. The defendant is using intimidating legal language to manipulate the proceedings. No legitimate spiritual counselor would have this kind of detailed knowledge of federal civil rights law. But Blake's response revealed just how carefully she'd been laying the groundwork for this moment. Mr. Hawthorne, you're absolutely correct. No legitimate spiritual counselor would have this knowledge. She paused, letting the implications settle. The question is, what kind of person would? Bailiff Ashford stepped closer to the defendant's table, his hand now openly resting on his radio. Your Honor, should I contact courthouse security? The threat escalated the situation from procedural dispute to potential physical confrontation. Blake remained seated, but her posture suggested someone completely comfortable with the possibility of authority figures attempting to intimidate her through shows of force. Bailiff Ashford, she said quietly, I appreciate your diligence. However, you might want to consider whether escalating this situation is in your professional best interest. The phrasing was careful, respectful, but carried an undertone that made the bailiff pause. It wasn't exactly a threat, but it suggested consequences that went beyond this courtroom. Judge Thornfield's frustration was reaching a breaking point. Mrs. A. Mercier, either you explain how a supposed psychic has detailed knowledge of federal civil rights law, or I hold you in contempt for disrupting these proceedings. Blake nodded thoughtfully, as if she'd been expecting exactly this ultimatum. Your Honor, that's a fair question. The answer is quite simple, but I suspect it might complicate your day more than you're currently prepared to handle. She reached into her jacket pocket, the same gesture observers had noticed earlier, and withdrew a small leather case. Instead of opening it immediately, she placed it on the defendant's table where everyone could see it. Before I answer your question directly, Blake continued, I need to ensure that Mrs. Whitmore and Mr. Hawthorne understand the potential implications for their fraud allegations. Cordelia Whitmore leaned forward in her chair, confusion evident on her face. What do you mean, implications? I mean, Mrs. Whitmore, that your lawsuit may have just exposed a federal investigation that has been ongoing for 18 months. And depending on how this court chooses to proceed, you may find yourself facing questions about whether your allegations constitute obstruction of a federal law enforcement operation. Legal emergencies can strike without warning, just like what we're witnessing in this courtroom drama. Legal Shield provides 24/7 access to experienced attorneys for a fraction of traditional legal fees. Whether you're facing identity theft, need document review, or require emergency legal consultation, Legal Shield has you covered. For less than $30 per month, you get comprehensive legal protection that could save you thousands. Visit LegalShield.com/protection to start your membership today and get your first month absolutely free. The courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the ambient noise from the hallway seemed to disappear as everyone processed what they'd just heard. Attorney Hawthorne recovered first, but his voice carried none of its earlier confidence. Your Honor, the defendant appears to be claiming some kind of federal authority. Judge Thornfield's hands were trembling slightly as he reached for his gavel. Mrs. Mercier, I'm ordering you to explain these statements immediately, or I will hold you in contempt and order your arrest. Blake looked at him with something approaching sympathy. Your Honor, I understand your position. However, before you make that order, you might want to consider whether arresting a federal agent conducting an undercover investigation is the kind of career decision you're prepared to defend. The leather case remained unopened on the table, but its presence seemed to fill the entire courtroom. Everyone could see it. Everyone understood its significance, but the revelation remained tantalizingly out of reach. Federal agent? Cordelia Whitmore's voice was barely a whisper. But you took my money. You claimed to talk to Harold's spirit. Blake turned to face the plaintiff directly, her expression showing genuine compassion for the first time since the proceedings began. Mrs. Whitmore, I understand your confusion. The truth is that every session we had, every conversation about Harold, was designed to help you process your grief while gathering intelligence about a much larger criminal operation. What criminal operation, Omatsa? Judge Thornfield demanded, his voice rising with each word. The one, Blake replied calmly, that uses grief counseling services as a front for money laundering, investment fraud, and identity theft targeting recent widows. The one that has generated over 57 victims in this district alone over the past 2 years. The courtroom gallery erupted into chaos. Voices rose in confusion, accusation, and disbelief as community members who had come to witness a simple fraud case found themselves in the middle of what appeared to be a federal law enforcement revelation. "This is ridiculous, Bonwati," shouted someone from the back row. "She's just trying to get out of paying back the money she stole." 57 victims? Another voice called out. "What about the families who trusted her?" Judge Thornfield pounded his gavel repeatedly, but the disruption continued to build. "Order! I will have order in this courtroom." Blake remained seated calmly at the defendant's table, observing the social dynamics with professional interest. The community reaction was splitting along predictable lines. Those who had personal experience with spiritual counseling services were defensive and suspicious, while others seemed intrigued by the possibility of a larger criminal conspiracy. Cordelia Whitmore stood up suddenly, her chair scraping against the floor. "Your Honor, I don't understand what's happening. If she's really a federal agent, why did she take my money? Why did she let me file this lawsuit?" Blake rose to face her directly, speaking with quiet authority. "Mrs. Whitmore, the sessions you paid for were legitimate grief counseling. I have extensive training in psychological support techniques, and everything I told you about processing Harold's death was designed to help you heal. But you claimed to speak with his spirit. No, ma'am. I provided you with insights about Harold's life and concerns based on psychological profiling and careful observation of your behavioral patterns. The spiritual framework was simply a context that allowed you to process difficult emotions in a way that felt meaningful to you." Attorney Hawthorne had been frantically shuffling through his papers, looking for some way to regain control of his case. "Your Honor, even if the defendant has some kind of federal connection, that doesn't excuse fraud. Taking money under false pretenses is illegal regardless of the perpetrator's day job." Blake turned to address him directly. "Mr. Hawthorne, you're absolutely correct about fraud being illegal. The question is whether providing legitimate psychological counseling under cover identity constitutes false pretenses, or whether it represents standard undercover law enforcement methodology." The distinction was subtle but crucial. Blake was reframing the entire case from spiritual fraud to law enforcement procedure, forcing everyone to consider whether federal agents operating undercover had different standards than private citizens offering services. Bailiff Ashford stepped forward again, this time with visible uncertainty. "Your Honor, what are my instructions here?" The question revealed the bailiff's growing awareness that he might be dealing with someone whose authority potentially superseded the local court system. His earlier confidence had evaporated, replaced by the careful uncertainty of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Blake addressed him directly. "Bailiff Ashford, I appreciate your professionalism. However, I should mention that attempting to detain a federal agent conducting an official investigation without proper jurisdiction could result in obstruction charges that fall under federal rather than state prosecution." The threat was delicately phrased, but its implications were clear. Ashford's hand moved away from his radio as he began to understand the potential career implications of escalating the situation. Right now, you're probably thinking this is just another case of someone pretending to have supernatural powers. But what's happening here is so much deeper and more dangerous than anyone in that courtroom realizes. The lives hanging in the balance will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. Smash that like button if you can feel the tension building, because we're about to witness something unprecedented. Judge Thornfield's authority was crumbling by the minute, but he made one last attempt to assert control. "Mrs. Mercier, I don't care what federal authority you claim to have. In my courtroom, I determine procedure. and I'm ordering you to open that identification case immediately or face contempt charges. Blake looked at him with what might have been pity. Your Honor, I understand your position. However, I need to point out that ordering a federal agent to reveal their credentials during an active undercover operation may itself constitute obstruction of a federal investigation. Are you threatening me? I'm informing you of the potential legal implications of your orders. Whether those implications constitute a threat depends entirely on your subsequent actions. The leather case remained unopened, but its psychological impact continued to grow. Everyone in the courtroom understood that its contents would fundamentally change the nature of the proceedings. But Blake was maintaining control over exactly when and how that revelation occurred. Court reporter Williams had resumed typing, but her usual professional detachment had given way to obvious fascination. The transcript she was creating would likely become evidence in whatever federal investigation was apparently unfolding, and she was beginning to understand that her role had shifted from routine documentation to historical record. A new voice spoke from the gallery. "Excuse me, Your Honor." A middle-aged black woman in professional attire stood up in the third row. "I'm Dr. Regina Patterson, and I've been a patient of Madame Serafina's for 4 months. If she's really a federal agent, I need to know whether my sessions with her are going to be used as evidence in some investigation." Blake turned to address Dr. Patterson with obvious respect. "Ma'am, your therapeutic sessions are protected under both patient confidentiality and federal evidence protocols. Nothing discussed in the context of grief counseling will be used for any purpose beyond helping you process your loss." "But what about the other investigation, the money laundering you mentioned? Any evidence related to that investigation comes from financial transactions, communication intercepts, and surveillance activities that don't involve individual counseling sessions. Your privacy is protected under multiple federal statutes." The exchange revealed Blake's detailed knowledge of evidence protocols and patient rights. Information that went far beyond what most people would know, even in law enforcement. Dr. Patterson sat down, apparently satisfied, but her questions had opened new avenues of inquiry for the other participants. Attorney Hawthorne realized that his simple fraud case was transforming into something far more complex than he'd anticipated. His usual strategy of overwhelming pro se defendants with legal terminology wasn't working against someone who appeared to have superior knowledge of federal law. "Your Honor," he said, attempting to regain the initiative, "I request that we pause these proceedings until the defendant's claims about federal authority can be verified through appropriate channels." Blake responded before Judge Thornfield could speak. "Mr. Hawthorne, that's an excellent suggestion. However, verification of undercover federal credentials requires contact with specific departments that don't typically respond to inquiries from state court proceedings. Then how do we know you're telling the truth? You don't, but you also don't know that I'm lying. The question becomes whether this court is prepared to risk the consequences of proceeding under the assumption that I'm fraudulent." The psychological pressure was building systematically. Blake was forcing the opposition to consider the potential downside of treating her as an ordinary defendant if she turned out to be a legitimate federal agent. Judge Thornfield was sweating visibly now. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. "Mrs. Mercier, if you are a federal agent, why didn't you reveal that fact when these proceedings began?" "Because, Your Honor, revealing federal credentials immediately would have compromised an ongoing investigation and potentially alerted targets who are still under surveillance." "What targets?" Blake paused, as if considering how much information she could safely reveal. "Your Honor, I can tell you that the investigation involves a network of service providers who exploit grieving clients for financial gain. The specific targets and methodology remain classified." The reference to classified information added another layer of federal authority to Blake's position. Even if local officials wanted to challenge her claims, they had no way to verify or disprove information that was supposedly protected by federal classification. Bailiff Ashford approached Judge Thornfield's bench and spoke in a low voice that was nonetheless audible throughout the courtroom. "Your Honor, should I contact the district attorney's office for guidance on federal jurisdiction issues?" The suggestion revealed Ashford's growing awareness that the situation had moved beyond local court authority. But Blake's response demonstrated her detailed knowledge of interagency protocols. "Bailiff Ashford, the district attorney's office doesn't have jurisdiction over federal investigations. If you need verification of my credentials, the appropriate contact would be the federal district court's liaison office, but they'll require specific authorization codes that I'm not permitted to release during active operations." "Then how do we resolve this situation?" Judge Thornfield demanded. Blake smiled, not mockingly, but with the patience of someone who had anticipated exactly this question. "Your Honor, there are several options. We can continue these proceedings with the understanding that you may be interfering with a federal investigation. We can pause while you contact appropriate federal authorities for verification, though that process typically takes several weeks. Or, she let the silence stretch, allowing everyone to wonder what the third option might be. Or, Thornfield prompted, or I can contact my federal supervisor and request permission to reveal my credentials directly to this court, with the understanding that doing so will likely terminate my undercover operation and potentially compromise the safety of other agents working related cases. The choice was subtle but devastating. Blake was offering to sacrifice her investigation to resolve the court's dilemma, but only at a cost that would make Judge Thornfield responsible for potentially endangering federal agents and allowing criminals to escape justice. A new commotion arose from the gallery as someone called out, "Is she really FBI?" Blake didn't turn around, but her voice carried clearly through the courtroom. Federal Bureau of Investigation is one possibility. There are several federal agencies that conduct undercover financial crime investigations. The moment had arrived for the final escalation before revelation. Judge Thornfield, trapped between his authority and growing evidence that he was confronting federal law enforcement, made a decision that would define everything that followed. "Mrs. Mercier, I'm ordering you to provide immediate verification of your claimed federal credentials, or I will find you in contempt and order your arrest." Blake looked at him steadily. "Your Honor, I need you to understand the implications of that order. Are you instructing me to compromise a federal investigation and reveal classified information, knowing that such revelation could endanger the lives of other federal agents? I'm instructing you to prove you have the authority you claim, or face the consequences of fraud and contempt." "Very well." Blake reached for the leather case on her table. "Your Honor, before I comply with your order, I need to state clearly for the court record that you are compelling the revelation of federal credentials during an active undercover operation against my professional judgment and contrary to standard federal protocols." Court reporter Williams typed every word, understanding that this statement would likely become crucial evidence in whatever investigations followed. Blake opened the leather case with deliberate precision, but instead of immediately revealing its contents, she made one more attempt to give Judge Thornfield an opportunity to reconsider. "Your Honor, once I show these credentials, this courtroom becomes part of a federal investigation. Every person present, every statement made, every procedural decision you've rendered will be subject to federal review. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Judge Thornfield's hands were shaking openly now, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down. "Show me the credentials, Mrs. Mercier." Blake nodded sadly as if she genuinely regretted what was about to happen. She lifted the leather case and turned it toward the judge, revealing federal identification that gleamed under the courtroom's fluorescent lights. But before anyone could read the specific details, the courtroom doors burst open with sudden authority. Witnessing this level of expertise makes you wonder what specialized knowledge could transform your own career. Masterclass offers exclusive access to courses taught by world-renowned experts in law enforcement, psychology, and criminal justice. Learn FBI interrogation techniques, forensic psychology, and behavioral analysis from the same professionals who solve real cases. Use code REVEAL, 20 for 20% off your annual membership at masterclass.com/law-enforcement and unlock the secrets behind criminal investigation mastery. United States Federal Marshal Service, announced a tall figure in a dark suit as he strode into the courtroom with practiced authority. "I'm Marshal Garrett Blackwell. I received an automated notification that federal credentials were being compromised in this proceeding." The courtroom fell into stunned silence. Marshal Blackwell's presence transformed the entire dynamic, confirming that Blake's claims had triggered real federal protocols. "Marshal Blackwell," Blake said, rising respectfully, "I'm Agent Blake Westbrook, FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit. My credentials were demanded by the court during compromise of an active undercover operation." "Agent Westbrook," Marshal Blackwell nodded formally, "I need immediate briefing on the operational status and potential security threats." "Yes, sir. Operation Widow's Grief has been investigating financial crimes targeting grief counseling clients. My cover identity was compromised when civil litigation forced credential revelation. The exchange was professional, formal, and completely authentic." Every word confirmed that Blake was exactly who she claimed to be, and that the federal authority she'd referenced was genuine. Judge Thornfield's face had gone completely white. "Marshal, I didn't know." She never identified herself as federal law enforcement. Marshal Blackwell turned his attention to the judge with the kind of expression that suggested heads were about to roll. "Your Honor, I need to understand exactly what circumstances led to the compromise of a federal agent's undercover credentials." The question wasn't a request. It was the beginning of what was obviously going to be a very uncomfortable federal investigation into the proceedings that had just concluded. Blake, meanwhile, closed her credential case and returned to the defendant's table. For the first time since the proceedings began, she looked relaxed, as if a tremendous weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said gently, turning to face the plaintiff who sat in stunned silence, "I want you to know that every conversation we had about Harold was genuine. The grief counseling was real, even though the context was more complex than either of us initially understood." Cordelia Whitmore looked up with tears in her eyes. "So Harold, you weren't really talking to his spirit?" "No, ma'am. But everything I told you about his love for you, his pride in your strength, and his confidence in your ability to build a meaningful life after his death, those insights came from careful observation of the evidence he left behind in your stories, your memories, and your own resilience. Then it was still real?" Blake smiled with genuine warmth. "Mrs. Whitmore, love doesn't end with death. Harold's influence on your life continues through the values he taught you and the strength you carry. No supernatural ability is required to see that truth." The courtroom had become something entirely different from what anyone had expected when the morning began. Instead of a simple fraud case, they had witnessed the conclusion of an 18-month federal investigation, the exposure of systemic judicial bias, and the revelation that sometimes the most extraordinary truths hide behind perfectly ordinary appearances. But as Marshall Blackwell began the process of securing the courtroom and preparing for federal investigation protocols, Blake knew that the story was far from over. The network she'd been investigating was vast, sophisticated, and dangerous. Compromising her undercover identity meant that other agents were now at risk, and the criminals they'd been tracking would know they were being hunted. Hold on to your seat, because what happens in the next few minutes will completely rewrite everything you've seen so far. The evidence she's about to present isn't just going to clear her name. It's going to expose a truth so shocking that it will send shockwaves through the entire legal system. Hit the notification bell now, because you absolutely cannot miss what comes next. The lock had indeed clicked twice, but the door that opened led not to simple resolution, but to a much larger and more dangerous truth that would test everything Blake had worked for over the past 18 months of her life. Marshall Blackwell's presence transformed the courtroom from a civil proceeding into what was clearly a federal crime scene. His movements were precise, economical, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking control of complex situations. As he surveyed the room, his practiced gaze cataloged every face, every exit, every potential security concern. "Agent Westbrook," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the now silent courtroom, "I need a preliminary assessment of operational security and potential witness protection requirements." Blake nodded, transitioning smoothly from her undercover persona to her professional federal role. "Marshall Blackwell, the compromise was contained to this proceeding. Primary investigation targets remained unaware of federal surveillance. However, we now have approximately 40 civilian witnesses to the credential revelation." "Understood. I'm implementing immediate containment protocols." Marshall Blackwell turned to address the courtroom gallery. "Ladies and gentlemen, you have just witnessed the conclusion of an 18-month federal investigation. For your own safety and the security of ongoing operations, I need everyone to remain seated while we process this situation." Judge Thornfield had been sitting in stunned silence, but Marshall Blackwell's words jolted him back to awareness of his precarious position. "Marshall, I need to understand. What exactly has been happening in my courtroom?" "Your Honor, Agent Westbrook will provide a complete briefing, but I can tell you that federal authorities have been investigating a sophisticated criminal network operating throughout this district. Your courthouse proceedings have been under surveillance as part of that investigation." The revelation sent a ripple of shock through the gallery. Community members who had come expecting a routine fraud case were discovering that their local court system had been infiltrated by federal law enforcement. Blake approached the bench, carrying her manila folder with newfound confidence. "Your Honor, I can now provide you with the evidence review you initially denied. This folder contains documented evidence of a money laundering operation that has been using grief counseling services as a front for financial crimes." She opened the folder, revealing documents that were clearly far more sophisticated than anything typically seen in small claims proceedings. Bank transaction records, wire transfer documentation, and what appeared to be surveillance photographs were organized with federal precision. "Mrs. Whitmore," Blake said, turning to address the plaintiff directly, "I need you to understand that your lawsuit inadvertently helped us identify several key players in this criminal network. Your financial transactions with my cover identity created a paper trail that led us to much larger criminal operations." Cordelia Whitmore looked up with confusion and growing concern. "Are you saying I'm in danger?" Not from the investigation itself, ma'am, but the people we've been investigating have been systematically targeting recent widows in this community. Your lawsuit may have saved other families from becoming victims. Attorney Hawthorne had been frantically reviewing his own files, beginning to understand the implications for his client and himself. Agent Westbrook, is my client facing any federal charges? Mr. Hawthorne, Mrs. Whitmore is a victim, not a target. However, I need to review your client's financial records to determine if she was directed to make investments that were part of the money laundering scheme. What investments? Blake referred to her federal documentation. According to our financial surveillance, Mrs. Whitmore was advised to invest Harold's life insurance payout in several companies that we now know are shell corporations. Those investments were designed to move illegal money through seemingly legitimate transactions. The courtroom fell silent as the implications became clear. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't just been a victim of spiritual fraud. She had unknowingly participated in a federal money laundering operation. Marshal Blackwell stepped forward. Agent Westbrook, what's the status of the primary targets? Sir, Operation Widow's Grief has identified 17 individuals involved in the network, including the operational director who calls himself the Widowmaker. We have sufficient evidence for federal prosecution on RICO charges, but the network's leadership remains unknown. The mention of RICO, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, indicated that this was far more than simple fraud. Federal authorities were pursuing charges typically reserved for organized crime operations. Agent Westbrook, Judge Thornfield interrupted, his voice shaking. How long have federal authorities been monitoring my courtroom? Blake's response was carefully measured. Your Honor, courthouse surveillance began 6 months ago when we identified patterns suggesting that certain legal proceedings were being manipulated to facilitate criminal operations. What patterns? Systematic bias in civil cases involving recent widows, procedural violations that favored defendants with connections to our target network, and coordination between court officials and outside parties that suggested corruption. The accusation hung in the air like a thunderbolt. Judge Thornfield was being informed that his own judicial conduct had been under federal investigation for months. Bailiff Ashford, who had been standing uncertainly near the courtroom entrance, finally spoke. Marshal, what are my instructions? I've never dealt with a federal crime scene before. Bailiff Ashford, you're going to assist with witness processing and evidence preservation. Agent Westbrook, do we have grounds for immediate arrests? Blake consulted her federal documentation. Sir, we have sufficient probable cause for several targets, but I recommend coordinating with the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network before making arrests. FinCEN has been tracking the money trail, and premature arrests could compromise their asset forfeiture operations. The mention of FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, added another layer of federal complexity to the investigation. This wasn't just FBI work. It was a multi-agency operation involving the Treasury Department's Financial Intelligence Unit. Court reporter Williams had been typing steadily throughout the federal briefing, but now she raised her hand tentatively. Agent Westbrook, is this transcript going to become federal evidence? Ms. Williams, your court transcript is now part of a federal criminal investigation. You've documented judicial bias, procedural violations, and witness intimidation that constitute evidence of civil rights violations under federal statute. The court reporter's face went pale as she realized that her routine stenography work had suddenly become crucial evidence in what appeared to be a massive federal prosecution. Dr. Regina Patterson, the grief counseling client who had spoken earlier, raised her hand again. Agent Westbrook, you said my sessions were protected by confidentiality. But what about the financial advice? I made investments based on your recommendations. Blake turned to address her with obvious concern. Dr. Patterson, any financial advice provided during our sessions was designed to protect you from the criminal network, not to exploit you. Can you tell me specifically what investments you made? You recommended that I avoid certain financial advisors who had contacted me after my husband's death. You said they were targeting vulnerable widows. That recommendation was accurate federal intelligence, ma'am. Those financial advisors are part of the criminal network we've been investigating. By avoiding them, you protected yourself from becoming a victim. Right now, you're probably thinking this is just another case of someone pretending to have supernatural powers. But what's happening here is so much deeper and more dangerous than anyone in that courtroom realizes. The lives hanging in the balance will make you question everything you thought you knew about justice. Smash that like button if you can feel the tension building, because we're about to witness something unprecedented. Marshal Blackwell had been conducting a quiet conversation with someone on his secure phone, and now he approached Blake with obvious urgency. Agent Westbrook, I just received word from the Joint Terrorism Task Force. The financial network you've been investigating has connections to international money laundering operations that may involve terrorism financing. The escalation was dramatic and immediate. What had begun as a local fraud case had evolved into a federal financial crimes investigation and was now potentially connected to national security threats. Blake's expression became grimly professional. "Marshal, that aligns with intelligence we developed about the network's overseas connections. The shell companies Mrs. Whitmore was directed to invest in have been receiving wire transfers from accounts linked to known terrorist financing operations." Cordelia Whitmore stood up abruptly, her face white with shock. "Are you saying I was unknowingly involved in terrorism financing?" "Mrs. Whitmore, you were a victim of a sophisticated operation designed to make innocent people unwitting participants in criminal activities. Your financial transactions helped us identify and track the criminal network." Attorney Hawthorne was frantically taking notes, beginning to understand the magnitude of the situation his client had stumbled into. "Agent Westbrook, what kind of federal protection is available for witnesses in terrorism-related cases?" "Mr. Hawthorne, that decision will be made by federal prosecutors, but Mrs. Whitmore's cooperation has been invaluable to national security. Federal authorities take witness protection very seriously in cases involving international criminal networks." Judge Thornfield had been listening to the federal briefing with growing alarm. "Agent Westbrook, you mentioned that my courtroom has been under surveillance. What exactly have federal authorities observed?" Blake opened another section of her federal documentation, revealing what appeared to be surveillance photographs and transcripts. "Your Honor, we have documented 17 separate instances of procedural bias favoring defendants with connections to the criminal network, systematic denial of evidence review rights to plaintiffs who might expose financial crimes, and coordination between court officials and outside parties that constitutes obstruction of justice." "Obstruction of justice?" Thornfield's voice cracked. "Your Honor, Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. Section 1503 defines obstruction of justice as interfering with the due administration of justice. When court officials systematically deny procedural rights to specific categories of plaintiffs, that interference becomes a federal crime." Marshal Blackwell stepped forward. "Your Honor, I need to inform you that you are now a subject of interest in a federal investigation. You have the right to legal counsel, and anything you say may be used as evidence in federal proceedings." The Miranda warning delivered to a sitting judge was unprecedented in most people's experience. The authority structure of the courtroom had been completely inverted. The federal agents now held ultimate power, while local officials faced potential criminal prosecution. Bailiff Ashford, who had been growing increasingly nervous throughout the proceedings, finally approached Marshal Blackwell directly. "Sir, I need to know if I'm facing federal charges. I was just following orders from court administration." "Bailiff Ashford, your cooperation will be noted in federal reports. However, I need you to understand that following orders is not a defense for civil rights violations under federal law." Blake intervened before the situation could escalate further. "Marshal Blackwell, Bailiff Ashford has been professional and cooperative throughout these proceedings. His actions appear to reflect institutional bias rather than individual corruption." "Noted, Agent Westbrook. However, all court personnel will be interviewed by federal investigators as part of the pattern and practice investigation." The courtroom had become a crime scene processing center, with federal authorities documenting evidence and preparing for what was obviously going to be a massive prosecution. Community members who had come as spectators were now potential witnesses in a federal terrorism financing case. Dr. Patterson raised her hand again. "Agent Westbrook, should I be concerned about my safety? If these people were targeting widows and I avoided their scheme, am I at risk?" Blake's response revealed the true scope of the danger. "Dr. Patterson, the network has been under constant federal surveillance for 18 months. However, now that the investigation is public, we need to implement immediate protection protocols for all witnesses." "Protection protocols?" "Federal marshals will be providing security assessments for key witnesses, and the FBI's Victim Services Unit will coordinate long-term protection as needed." Marshal Blackwell concluded his phone conversation and addressed the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I need everyone to remain seated while we process witness information and coordinate with federal security teams. This courtroom is now an active federal crime scene." The transformation was complete. A routine small claims proceeding had become the epicenter of a federal investigation involving money laundering, terrorism financing, judicial corruption, and civil rights violations. Blake approached Cordelia Whitmore with obvious compassion. "Mrs. Whitmore, I know this is overwhelming, but I need you to understand something important. Every session we had, every conversation about Harold was designed to help you heal while protecting you from people who wanted to exploit your grief. But the spiritual readings, The insights I provided about Harold were based on careful observation of your memories, your emotional responses, and the evidence of his character that came through in your stories. No supernatural ability was required to see that he loved you deeply and would want you to build a meaningful life after his death. Tears streamed down Cordelia's face. So it was still real? Mrs. Whitmore, love transcends death through the impact it has on our lives. Harold's influence on your values, your strength, and your capacity for healing, those are real, whether or not I could actually communicate with his spirit. Attorney Hawthorne had been reviewing federal statutes on his phone, trying to understand the legal implications for his client. Agent Westbrook, what happens to the civil case now that federal jurisdiction has been established? Mr. Hawthorne, the civil case will be dismissed due to federal preemption, but Mrs. Whitmore may be entitled to restitution through federal victim compensation programs. Restitution? Blake consulted her federal documentation. Federal law provides compensation for victims of terrorism financing operations. Mrs. Whitmore's financial losses may be recoverable through asset forfeiture proceedings against the criminal network. The mention of asset forfeiture indicated that federal authorities had been tracking the network's finances and preparing to seize criminal assets for victim compensation. Marshal Blackwell had been coordinating with federal security teams, and now he approached Blake with obvious urgency. Agent Westbrook, I just received intelligence that the network's leadership has been alerted to our investigation. We need to expedite arrests before they can destroy evidence or flee jurisdiction. Blake's response revealed the complexity of the federal operation. Marshal, premature arrests could compromise our asset tracking. FinCEN needs another 48 hours to complete the financial mapping before we move against the leadership. We may not have 48 hours. NSA Signals Intelligence indicates that encrypted communications within the network have increased dramatically since news of this courthouse incident began spreading. The mention of NSA, National Security Agency, involvement indicated that the investigation had reached the highest levels of federal intelligence operations. Electronic surveillance was being conducted by agencies typically reserved for international terrorism cases. Judge Thornfield, who had been listening to the federal coordination with growing alarm, finally interrupted. Agent Westbrook, am I under arrest? Do I need to contact my attorney? Blake turned to address him with professional courtesy. Your Honor, you are currently a subject of interest in a federal investigation, but no arrest warrant has been issued. However, I strongly recommend that you obtain legal counsel experienced in federal criminal defense. What charges am I potentially facing? Federal prosecutors will make charging decisions, but the documented pattern of procedural bias could support charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, and 18 U.S.C. Section 371, conspiracy to commit federal crimes. The specific federal statutes carried potential sentences of decades in federal prison. Judge Thornfield's career and freedom were suddenly in jeopardy because of judicial bias that he might not have even recognized as criminal conduct. Court Administrator Vance Sterling, who had been conspicuously absent since the federal authorities arrived, suddenly returned to the courtroom with several security officers. His entrance created immediate tension as Marshal Blackwell's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon. Marshal Blackwell, Sterling called out, I need to understand the federal jurisdiction here. This courthouse operates under state authority, and I have concerns about federal agents conducting operations without proper notification. Blake stepped forward before Marshal Blackwell could respond. Administrator Sterling, federal jurisdiction was established the moment this proceeding revealed evidence of federal crimes. Your cooperation is expected, but your permission is not required. What federal crimes? Blake opened her complete case file, revealing the full scope of the investigation. Money laundering in violation of 18 U.S.C. Section 1956, terrorism financing under 18 U.S.C. Section TOC 3339B, racketeering under RICO statutes, civil rights violations under Section 242, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The list of federal charges was staggering in its scope and severity. Sterling's face went pale as he began to understand the magnitude of what federal authorities had uncovered. Administrator Sterling, Marshal Blackwell said, I need you to understand that interfering with a federal terrorism investigation is itself a federal crime. I strongly recommend cooperation. Sterling's security officers looked uncertain, clearly uncomfortable with the prospect of confronting federal agents in what had become an active federal operation. Blake addressed Sterling directly. Mr. Sterling, you have an opportunity to cooperate with federal authorities and potentially receive consideration for your assistance. However, that opportunity may not remain available indefinitely. What kind of cooperation? Information about coordination between court officials and outside parties, financial records related to courthouse operations, and testimony regarding any pressure you may have received to influence judicial proceedings. The offer was carefully phrased to suggest that Sterling might be a victim of pressure rather than a willing participant in corruption. Blake was providing him with a potential path to cooperation that might protect him from prosecution. Dr. Patterson, who had been listening to the federal briefing with growing concern, stood up again. Agent Westbrook, you mentioned that the network has been targeting recent widows. How many other people in this community are at risk? Blake consulted her federal intelligence files. Dr. Patterson, we've identified 47 potential victims in this district alone, and similar networks are operating in 6 other federal districts. The scope of the criminal operation is national. 47 victims? Ma'am, the network has been systematically identifying recent widows through obituary monitoring, social media surveillance, and information purchased from data brokers. They target women who have recently received life insurance payouts or inheritance distributions. The revelation of systematic targeting sent a shock through the courtroom gallery. Community members were discovering that their local grief counseling services had been infiltrated by a national criminal conspiracy. Cordelia Whitmore stood up with obvious distress. Agent Westbrook, how many other women like me have been victimized? Blake's response revealed the true scope of the investigation. Mrs. Whitmore, federal records indicate that the network has stolen over $12 million from grieving families nationwide. Your lawsuit helped us identify and track these crimes. $12 million? The network operates sophisticated shell companies, fake investment opportunities, and fraudulent counseling services. They exploit grief to manipulate financial decisions and steal inheritance money that families need for rebuilding their lives. Marshall Blackwell received another secure phone call and approached Blake with obvious urgency. Agent Westbrook, federal prosecutors are requesting immediate briefing on arrestable offenses. The Attorney General's office wants to move before the network can destroy evidence. Blake nodded grimly. Marshal, we have sufficient probable cause for arrest warrants on 17 individuals, including conspiracy, money laundering, and terrorism financing charges. However, the network's leadership may escape if we move too quickly. The decision has been made at the highest levels. Federal arrest teams are being deployed within the hour. Legal emergencies can strike without warning, just like what we're witnessing in this courtroom drama. Legal Shield provides 24/7 access to experienced attorneys for a fraction of traditional legal fees. Whether you're facing identity theft, need document review, or require emergency legal consultation, Legal Shield has you covered. For less than $30 per month, you get comprehensive legal protection that could save you thousands. Visit LegalShield.com/protection to start your membership today and get your first month absolutely free. Marshall Blackwell concluded his secure communication and turned to address the courtroom with formal authority. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to provide complete disclosure about the federal operation you have witnessed today. Blake stood at attention as Marshall Blackwell prepared to reveal the full scope of her identity and authority. Agent Westbrook, Marshall Blackwell said, please provide your complete federal credentials for court documentation. Blake opened her federal identification case fully, revealing credentials that were far more extensive than anyone had anticipated. I am Blake Westbrook, Assistant Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation Behavioral Analysis Unit. I hold the rank of Senior Executive Service Level 4, with supervisory authority over federal criminal investigations involving behavioral crime patterns. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Blake wasn't just a federal agent. She was among the highest-ranking officials in the FBI, with authority that superseded virtually all local law enforcement. Assistant Director Westbrook, Marshall Blackwell continued formally, please state your qualifications and experience for court record. I hold a PhD in criminal psychology from Georgetown University, a JD from Harvard Law School, and have completed 15 years of federal service, including 8 years in undercover operations. I am certified in advanced behavioral analysis, financial crime investigation, and counterterrorism operations. Judge Thornfield stared in complete shock. For the past 2 hours, he had been treating one of the most senior federal law enforcement officials in the country as a fraudulent psychic, denying her procedural rights and threatening her with arrest. Assistant Director Tsante, Marshall Blackwell said, please explain the scope of Operation Widow's Grief for official documentation. Blake approached the federal evidence display she had prepared. Operation Widow's Grief is an 18-month federal investigation targeting a national criminal network that exploits grief counseling services for money laundering and terrorism financing. The network has generated over $57 million in criminal proceeds through systematic targeting of inheritance recipients. 57 million? Attorney Hawthorne's voice was barely a whisper. The network operates in 14 states and has connections to international terrorism financing operations in 7 countries. Federal surveillance has identified 134 individual victims and 43 criminal participants. Blake displayed federal surveillance photographs showing the scope of the operation. The network's operational director, who calls himself the Widowmaker, has been personally responsible for financial crimes targeting vulnerable families nationwide. Cordelia Whitmore looked up with tears streaming down her face. You mean Harold? Our life insurance? We were specifically targeted? Mrs. Whitmore, your husband's obituary was monitored by network surveillance. Within 72 hours of the funeral, data brokers provided the network with your financial information, family status, and emotional vulnerability assessment. They knew exactly how much money I had. Blake's response revealed the sophisticated nature of the criminal operation. Mrs. Whitmore, the network purchases data from insurance companies, social media platforms, and financial institutions. They knew Harold's exact life insurance payout before you received it. Dr. Patterson stood up with obvious alarm. Assistant Director Westbrook, am I safe? If I avoided their scheme, do they know who I am? Blake consulted her federal intelligence files. Dr. Patterson, you are currently under federal protection surveillance. The network attempted to target you, but my intervention during our counseling sessions disrupted their operation. Federal protection surveillance? Ma'am, FBI agents have been monitoring your residence and financial accounts to prevent criminal targeting. Your safety has been a federal priority since you began grief counseling sessions. The courtroom was beginning to understand the massive scope of the federal operation. What had appeared to be simple spiritual fraud was actually the culmination of an 18-month investigation into a national criminal conspiracy. Administrator Sterling, who had been listening with growing panic, finally spoke. Assistant Director Westbrook, what evidence does the FBI have regarding courthouse operations? Blake displayed federal surveillance documentation that revealed the systematic nature of judicial bias. Mr. Sterling, federal agents have documented 43 separate instances of procedural violations favoring defendants connected to the criminal network. 43 instances. The pattern includes denial of evidence review rights, expedited case processing for network associates, and coordination between court officials and external parties to influence judicial outcomes. Judge Thornfield's hands were shaking as he began to understand the scope of federal evidence against him. Assistant Director, are you saying that federal agents have been monitoring my judicial decisions for 18 months? Your Honor, federal surveillance began when FinCEN flagged suspicious financial patterns involving court proceedings. The Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network identified coordination between judicial decisions and money laundering operations. What coordination? Blake displayed federal financial surveillance records. Your Honor, network associates received favorable court treatment in 43 separate proceedings, allowing them to maintain criminal operations that generated millions of dollars in illegal proceeds. Bailiff Ashford, who had been standing in shocked silence, finally spoke. Assistant Director, am I facing federal prosecution? I was just following standard courthouse procedures. Blake turned to address him with professional assessment. Bailiff Ashford, federal investigators distinguish between individual corruption and systemic pressure. Your actions appear to reflect institutional bias rather than personal criminal intent. What does that mean for my career? Federal authorities recognize that courthouse employees may be victims of institutional pressure rather than willing participants in corruption. Your cooperation will be noted in federal reports. Marshal Blackwell received another secure communication and approached Blake with obvious urgency. Assistant Director Westbrook, federal arrest teams are requesting immediate coordination. The network's leadership has begun destroying evidence. Blake nodded grimly. Marshal Blackwell, implement immediate arrest protocols. We have sufficient evidence for federal prosecution under RICO statutes, and delay risks evidence destruction. Understood. Federal tactical teams are deploying to 14 locations simultaneously. The coordination revealed the massive scope of the federal operation. While the courthouse revelation had been unfolding, federal authorities had been preparing coordinated arrests across multiple states. Assistant Director, Court Reporter Williams said tentatively, is my transcript going to be classified? I've never documented a federal terrorism investigation before. Blake smiled reassuringly. Ms. Williams, your transcript is now crucial evidence in a national security investigation. Federal authorities will ensure your safety and provide recognition for your professional service. Recognition? Ma'am, your documentation of civil rights violations and judicial bias will be instrumental in federal prosecution. The Department of Justice takes note of civilians who contribute to national security operations. Hold on to your seat because what happens in the next few minutes will completely rewrite everything you've seen so far. The evidence she's about to present isn't just going to clear her name. It's going to expose a truth so shocking that it will send shockwaves through the entire legal system. Hit the notification bell now because you absolutely cannot miss what comes next. Federal tactical teams were deploying across the region, but the immediate focus remained on processing the courthouse evidence and securing witness cooperation. Marshal Blackwell coordinated with federal prosecutors while Blake prepared for what would be the formal conclusion of her undercover operation. Assistant Director Westbrook, Marshal Blackwell announced, federal prosecutors are requesting immediate administrative hearing to formalize evidence presentation and witness protection protocols. Blake nodded and approached the federal evidence display. Marshal, I'm prepared to present complete operational findings for federal prosecution review. Ladies and gentlemen, Marshal Blackwell addressed the courtroom, you are about to witness the formal conclusion of a major federal investigation. The evidence presented will be used in federal prosecution of a national criminal conspiracy. Judge Thornfield attempted to assert his remaining authority. Marshal Blackwell, this is still my courtroom. What procedures govern federal evidence presentation in state court facilities? Blake answered before Marshal Blackwell could respond. Your Honor, federal jurisdiction supersedes state authority in cases involving national security. However, federal protocols require formal evidence authentication for prosecution purposes. She opened her complete federal case file, revealing documentation that was clearly far beyond anything typically seen in civilian proceedings. I am presenting 18 months of federal surveillance evidence documenting a criminal network that has operated across 14 states. Blake began displaying federal surveillance photographs, financial records, and intelligence reports with systematic precision. The network operates under the cover of grief counseling services, but federal analysis reveals sophisticated money laundering operations designed to move illegal proceeds through seemingly legitimate transactions. Cordelia Whitmore stared at photographs showing her own financial transactions. Assistant Director, you're saying that my grief counseling payments were part of money laundering? Mrs. Whitmore, your payments were legitimate grief counseling fees. However, the network used legitimate transactions like yours to disguise illegal money movement from terrorism financing operations. How? Blake displayed federal financial analysis charts. The network mixes legitimate counseling payments with illegal proceeds, creating transaction patterns that appear normal to banking surveillance systems. Dr. Patterson raised her hand. Assistant Director, if my payments were legitimate, why did you discourage certain financial advisors? Blake consulted federal intelligence files. Dr. Patterson, the financial advisors who contacted you were network associates attempting to direct your inheritance into shell companies controlled by terrorism financing operations. Terrorism financing? Ma'am, federal intelligence indicates that the network has been moving illegal proceeds to overseas accounts linked to known terrorist organizations. Your inheritance would have been stolen and potentially used to fund international terrorism. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Community members were discovering that local financial advisors had been attempting to steal their money for terrorism financing. Administrator Sterling had been listening with growing panic, and now he made a desperate attempt to distance himself from the criminal network. Assistant Director Westbrook, I need you to understand that court administration was not involved in any criminal activities. Blake displayed federal surveillance records documenting Sterling's activities. Mr. Bonmassa. Sterling, federal surveillance has documented 17 separate instances of coordination between your office and network associates. What coordination? Federal agents observed meetings between court administration and individuals who are now under federal indictment for money laundering and terrorism financing. Sterling's face went white. Those were routine administrative meetings? Mr. Sterling, federal surveillance includes audio recordings and financial transaction analysis. The meetings involved coordination of judicial procedures to benefit criminal network operations. Marshal Blackwell stepped forward. Mr. Sterling, I need to inform you that you are now a target of federal investigation. You have the right to legal counsel, and anything you say will be used as evidence in federal prosecution. The formal arrest warning delivered to the court administrator completed the transformation of local authority. Federal agents now held complete control while local officials faced potential decades in federal prison. Attorney Hawthorne had been frantically reviewing federal statutes trying to understand the implications for his client and himself. Assistant Director Westbrook, is there any possibility that my client could face federal charges? Blake consulted federal prosecution guidelines. Mr. Hawthorne, Mrs. Whitmore is classified as a victim rather than a target. However, federal prosecutors may require her testimony in criminal proceedings against network associates. What about witness protection? Federal witness protection decisions are made by the U.S. Attorney's Office, but Mrs. Whitmore's cooperation has been valuable to national security. Federal authorities take witness safety very seriously. Judge Thornfield, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally spoke. Assistant Director, what happens to my judicial career? Am I facing immediate removal from the bench? Blake's response was measured but firm. Your Honor, federal prosecutors will present evidence to the Judicial Conduct Commission regarding systematic civil rights violations. Removal proceedings will be determined by federal judicial oversight authorities. What evidence? Blake displayed federal documentation of Thornfield's judicial bias. Federal surveillance has documented 43 instances of procedural violations favoring criminal network associates, systematic denial of due process rights to specific categories of plaintiffs, and coordination with external parties to influence judicial outcomes. I was just following standard legal procedures. Your Honor, federal civil rights law does not recognize standard procedures as a defense for systematic bias. Equal protection under law is guaranteed by federal constitutional provisions that supersede local judicial customs. Witnessing this level of expertise makes you wonder what specialized knowledge could transform your own career. Masterclass offers exclusive access to courses taught by world-renowned experts in law enforcement, psychology, and criminal justice. Learn FBI interrogation techniques, forensic psychology, and behavioral analysis from the same professionals who solve real cases. Use code REVEAL. 20% off your annual membership at masterclass.com/law enforcement and unlock the secrets behind criminal investigation mastery. Marshall Blackwell concluded another secure communication and approached Blake with obvious urgency. Assistant Director, federal arrest operations are complete. 17 individuals are in federal custody and evidence recovery teams are processing 14 locations. Blake nodded with professional satisfaction. Marshall, what's the status of the network's leadership? The individual known as the Widowmaker was arrested at a private airport attempting to flee to a non-extradition country. Federal agents recovered over $2 million in cash and encrypted communications devices. The courtroom erupted in murmurs as community members realized that a major criminal leader had been captured as a direct result of the courthouse proceedings they had witnessed. Assistant Director, Dr. Patterson asked, "Does this mean the danger is over? Are we safe now?" Blake's response revealed the complex nature of criminal investigations. Dr. Patterson, the immediate danger from this network has been eliminated. However, federal intelligence indicates that similar networks may be operating in other regions. Other networks? Ma'am, criminal organizations adapt quickly to law enforcement pressure. Federal authorities will continue monitoring for similar operations targeting vulnerable communities. Cordelia Whitmore stood up with obvious relief mixed with continued confusion. Assistant Director Westbrook, I still don't understand everything that happened. Was our grief counseling relationship real, or was it all just an investigation? Blake approached Mrs. Whitmore with genuine warmth. Mrs. Whitmore, every conversation we had about Harold, every insight about processing your grief, every moment of emotional support, those were completely genuine. But you weren't really a psychic. No, ma'am. But everything I told you about Harold's love, his pride in your strength, and his confidence in your ability to rebuild your life, those insights came from careful observation of the evidence he left in your memories and your own resilience. So the healing was real? Blake smiled with obvious affection. Mrs. Whitmore, grief counseling is based on helping people process emotional trauma and develop healthy coping mechanisms. The therapeutic framework we use was legitimate professional practice. And the spiritual elements? The spiritual context provided a framework that helped you process difficult emotions in a way that felt meaningful. Whether or not spirits actually communicate with the living, the love and influence Harold had on your life continues through the values he taught you. Tears streamed down Cordelia's face, but she was smiling. Thank you for everything. Blake nodded respectfully. Mrs. Whitmore, it has been an honor to know you and to help you honor Harold's memory. Federal prosecutors arrived at the courthouse within 2 hours of the arrest operations, transforming the building into the operational center for what was being called one of the largest financial crimes prosecutions in recent history. The community members who had witnessed the courthouse revelation found themselves at the center of a national news story. Blake coordinated with federal prosecution teams while continuing to process witness interviews and evidence authentication. The systematic nature of the federal operation became clear as specialized teams handled different aspects of the investigation. Assistant Director Westbrook, Federal Prosecutor Maria Santos announced as she entered the courtroom with a team of federal attorneys. I need immediate briefing on prosecution readiness and witness protection requirements. Blake consulted her comprehensive case files. Prosecutor Santos, We have sufficient evidence for federal prosecution under RICO statutes, money laundering laws, and terrorism financing regulations. 17 individuals are in federal custody with additional warrants pending. What's the financial scope? Federal asset forfeiture teams have identified $57 million in criminal proceeds, including real estate, offshore accounts, and shell company assets. Prosecutor Santos reviewed the preliminary federal evidence. Assistant Director, this prosecution will require extensive witness testimony. What protection protocols are in place? Blake gestured to the community members who remained in the courtroom. These individuals have provided crucial witness testimony and will require federal protection during prosecution proceedings. How many witnesses? 43 community members have provided testimony or evidence, including court personnel who documented civil rights violations. Prosecutor Santos addressed the courtroom directly. Ladies and gentlemen, you have been instrumental in exposing a major criminal conspiracy. Federal authorities will ensure your safety and provide compensation for your cooperation. Judge Thornfield, who had been sitting in stunned silence, finally spoke. Prosecutor Santos, what is my legal status? Am I facing federal prosecution? Prosecutor Santos consulted federal charging guidelines. Your Honor, federal prosecutors are reviewing evidence of systematic civil rights violations. Charging decisions will be made within 30 days. What charges am I potentially facing? Federal prosecutors are considering charges under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law, and 18 U.S.C. Section 371, conspiracy to commit federal crimes. What penalties do those charges carry? Blake answered directly. Your Honor, systematic civil rights violations can carry sentences of up to 10 years in federal prison per violation. Conspiracy charges can add additional penalties. The reality of decades in federal prison finally broke through Judge Thornfield's denial. His judicial career was over, and his freedom was in serious jeopardy. Administrator Sterling, who had been attempting to distance himself from the criminal network, made a final attempt to negotiate cooperation. Prosecutor Santos, I'm willing to provide complete cooperation with federal authorities. Prosecutor Santos reviewed Sterling's potential charges. Mr. Sterling, federal prosecutors appreciate cooperation, but charging decisions depend on the scope of criminal involvement. What would cooperation involve? Blake consulted federal intelligence files. Mr. Sterling, federal authorities need information about coordination between court administration and criminal network associates, financial records related to courthouse operations, and testimony regarding pressure to influence judicial proceedings. And in exchange, Prosecutor Santos was non-committal. Federal prosecutors consider cooperation when determining charges, but no promises can be made without reviewing the complete scope of criminal involvement. Marshal Blackwell received another secure communication and approached the prosecution team. Prosecutor Santos, federal asset forfeiture teams are requesting immediate coordination. The network's financial assets are being moved through international transfers. What's the urgency? Blake consulted real-time federal intelligence. Prosecutor Santos, network associates who were not arrested are attempting to move criminal assets to non-recoverable offshore accounts. We have approximately 6 hours before significant assets disappear permanently. Implement immediate asset freezing protocols. I'll coordinate with Treasury Department enforcement teams. The federal response revealed the sophisticated nature of criminal asset recovery operations. Multiple federal agencies were coordinating simultaneously to prevent criminal proceeds from escaping federal jurisdiction. Dr. Patterson, who had been listening to federal prosecution planning, raised her hand. Prosecutor Santos, how long will federal prosecution take? I'm concerned about ongoing safety risks. Prosecutor Santos consulted federal case management protocols. Dr. Patterson, federal prosecution of complex financial crimes typically requires 12 to 18 months. However, federal authorities provide witness protection throughout the prosecution process. What does witness protection involve? Blake answered based on federal witness protection protocols. Dr. Patterson, federal protection can include residential security, financial monitoring, and relocation assistance if necessary. Will I need to relocate? Ma'am, protection decisions are based on threat assessment and individual circumstances. Federal authorities prioritize witness safety while minimizing disruption to your life. Cordelia Whitmore, who had been quiet during federal prosecution planning, finally spoke. Prosecutor Santos, will I receive compensation for the financial losses from this criminal network? Prosecutor Santos consulted federal victim compensation guidelines. Mrs. Whitmore, federal asset forfeiture proceedings typically provide compensation to victims of financial crimes. How much compensation? Blake consulted federal recovery estimates. Mrs. Whitmore, Federal authorities have identified criminal assets exceeding $57 million. Victim compensation will be distributed based on individual losses and federal guidelines. What about the emotional damage? Prosecutor Santos was sympathetic but realistic. Mrs. Whitmore, federal victim compensation focuses on financial restitution rather than emotional damages. However, federal victim services provide counseling and support resources. If this story left you speechless, wait until you hear about the homeless veteran who walked into a corporate boardroom meeting and revealed he was actually the company's largest shareholder. That video is dropping next week, so make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on because these real-life plot twists just keep getting more incredible. Federal prosecution teams established operational headquarters at the courthouse, transforming the building into a coordination center for what had become a national criminal investigation. News media began arriving as word of the major federal operation spread through law enforcement networks. Blake coordinated with federal public affairs teams to manage information release while protecting ongoing operations. The balance between public transparency and operational security required careful coordination with multiple federal agencies. Assistant Director Westbrook, Federal Public Affairs Coordinator James Mitchell announced, "We're receiving inquiries from national news organizations about the scope of this operation." Blake consulted federal information release protocols. Coordinator Mitchell, "We can confirm the arrest of 17 individuals on federal charges related to financial crimes. However, investigation details remain classified to protect ongoing operations." What about the terrorism financing connections? Federal authorities are investigating potential connections to international criminal organizations, but specific details cannot be released during active prosecution. Judge Thornfield, who had been sitting in defeated silence, finally approached Blake directly. "Assistant Director, I need to understand what happens next. My judicial career is obviously over, but what about my family?" Blake's response showed professional compassion. "Your Honor, federal prosecutors distinguish between systematic bias and intentional corruption. Your cooperation with the investigation will be noted in federal sentencing recommendations." What kind of cooperation? Federal authorities need information about pressure you may have received to influence judicial proceedings, financial records related to courthouse operations, and testimony regarding coordination with external parties. I never understood that I was being manipulated. The coordination seemed like routine administrative efficiency. Blake nodded with understanding. "Your Honor, criminal organizations are sophisticated at manipulating institutional processes without revealing their true purposes. Federal authorities recognize that manipulation rather than corruption may explain many of the procedural violations." Prosecutor Santos reviewed federal charging guidelines and approached Judge Thornfield. "Your Honor, federal prosecutors are prepared to consider alternative sentencing arrangements in exchange for complete cooperation and judicial reform commitments." Alternative sentencing? Federal guidelines allow for supervised release, judicial education requirements, and community service in cases where defendants demonstrate genuine commitment to reform. What would that involve? Blake consulted federal rehabilitation protocols. "Your Honor, alternative sentencing could include federal judicial bias training, community service focused on civil rights education, and supervision by federal judicial oversight authorities. Instead of federal prison?" Prosecutor Santos was careful not to make promises. Federal prosecutors consider all relevant factors when making sentencing recommendations, including cooperation, acceptance of responsibility, and commitment to preventing future violations. Administrator Sterling, who had been listening to federal prosecution discussions, approached Blake with obvious desperation. "Assistant Director, I'm prepared to provide complete cooperation. I have information about pressure from external parties that court administration didn't understand." Blake consulted Sterling's federal intelligence file. "Mr. Sterling, federal authorities need specific information about meetings with network associates, financial transactions involving courthouse operations, and documentation of external pressure. I have records, emails, meeting schedules, financial documents. I kept everything because I was suspicious of some of the requests." "What kind of requests?" Sterling opened his briefcase and withdrew files that he had apparently been keeping as insurance. "External parties requested expedited processing for specific cases, coordination of hearing schedules to accommodate particular defendants, and information about plaintiff financial status." Blake reviewed the documentation with immediate interest. "Mr. Sterling, these records provide crucial evidence of criminal network coordination. Your cooperation could be instrumental in federal prosecution." Prosecutor Santos examined the additional evidence. "Mr. Sterling, this documentation supports conspiracy charges against network leadership. Your cooperation will be noted in federal prosecution recommendations." Court reporter Williams, who had been documenting the federal proceedings, approached Blake with professional curiosity. Assistant Director, how will my transcript be used in federal prosecution? I've never been involved in a national security case before. Blake smiled with obvious respect. Ms. Williams, your documentation of civil rights violations and judicial bias provides crucial evidence for federal prosecution. Court reporters are essential to federal justice operations. Will I need to testify in federal court? Ms. Williams, federal prosecutors may request your testimony regarding the accuracy of your transcript and your observations of courthouse operations. What about my safety? If this was a dangerous criminal network, Prosecutor Santos addressed her concerns directly. Ms. Williams, federal witness protection extends to all individuals who provide crucial evidence. Your safety is a federal priority. Dr. Patterson, who had been observing federal operations with fascination, approached Blake. Assistant Director, what happens to the legitimate grief counseling community? Will people trust these services after this investigation? Blake's response revealed her genuine concern for the community impact. Dr. Patterson, federal authorities will work with legitimate grief counseling organizations to establish certification and oversight protocols that protect vulnerable clients. What kind of protocols? Federal guidelines for background checks, financial transparency, and professional oversight that prevent criminal infiltration while preserving legitimate therapeutic services. Will you continue to work in grief counseling? Blake smiled with obvious affection. Dr. Patterson, my federal responsibilities require me to return to FBI headquarters, but my experience with this community has been personally meaningful. Thank you for protecting us. Blake nodded respectfully. Dr. Patterson, it has been an honor to serve this community and to help protect families during their most vulnerable times. As federal operations concluded at the courthouse, Blake began preparing for her return to FBI headquarters and the complex debriefing process that would follow 18 months of undercover work. However, the investigation had uncovered connections that extended far beyond the immediate criminal network. Federal intelligence teams were analyzing communications intercepts and financial records that suggested the network was part of a larger criminal conspiracy operating across multiple federal jurisdictions. Assistant Director Westbrook, FBI intelligence analyst Harper Whitfield approached with classified briefing materials. We've identified concerning patterns in the network's communications that suggest connections to operations in 7 other federal districts. Blake reviewed the intelligence analysis with growing concern. Analyst Whitfield, what kind of patterns? Encrypted communications referencing coordinated operations targeting inheritance recipients nationwide. The financial scope appears to be significantly larger than our initial estimates. How much larger? Whitfield consulted classified financial intelligence. Assistant Director, preliminary analysis suggests that coordinated networks may have generated over $200 million in criminal proceeds across multiple states. Blake's expression became grimly professional. Analyst Whitfield, that scope indicates organized crime involvement rather than opportunistic fraud. Yes, ma'am. Federal intelligence suggests that the network we investigated was one operational unit within a much larger criminal organization. The revelation meant that Operation Widow's Grief, rather than concluding a criminal investigation, had exposed the edges of a massive criminal conspiracy that might require years of additional federal investigation. Federal Prosecutor Santos reviewed the expanded intelligence analysis. Assistant Director Westbrook, if this network is part of a larger criminal organization, we need to implement immediate protection protocols for witnesses and expand federal investigation scope. Blake consulted federal threat assessment protocols. Prosecutor Santos, the criminal organization may now view our witnesses as ongoing threats rather than isolated victims. What does that mean for community safety? Federal authorities need to implement extended protection protocols and establish permanent liaison with local law enforcement to monitor potential retaliation attempts. Marshall Blackwell approached with obviously urgent intelligence. Assistant Director, NSA communications intercepts have identified encrypted messages referencing the courthouse operation and potential retaliation against witnesses. Blake's response was immediate and decisive. Marshall Blackwell, implement immediate threat assessment protocols for all witnesses. I want federal protection teams assigned within 6 hours. What about the broader investigation? Blake consulted federal investigation protocols. Marshall, the expanded scope requires FBI task force coordination with multiple federal agencies. This investigation is far from over. Dr. Patterson overheard the federal coordination and approached with obvious concern. Assistant Director, are you saying we're still in danger? Blake's response was honest but reassuring. Dr. Patterson, federal authorities have identified potential ongoing threats, but federal protection protocols are designed to ensure witness safety. Ongoing threats? Ma'am, the criminal network we investigated appears to be part of a larger criminal organization that may view witnesses as continuing security risks. How long will federal protection continue? Prosecutor Santos answered based on federal protection guidelines. Dr. Patterson, federal witness protection continues throughout prosecution proceedings and beyond if threat assessment indicates ongoing danger. Cordelia Whitmore, who had been listening to federal threat assessment discussions, approached Blake with obvious worry. Assistant Director, should I be afraid? I just want to rebuild my life after Harold's death. Blake addressed her with genuine compassion. Mrs. Whitmore, federal authorities will ensure your safety while you rebuild your life. However, the criminal organization may view your cooperation as a threat to their ongoing operations. What should I do? Mrs. Whitmore, federal protection teams will coordinate with local law enforcement to monitor your security. Additionally, federal victim services will help you relocate if necessary. Relocate? Blake consulted federal protection protocols. Mrs. Whitmore, relocation is one option for ensuring long-term safety. But federal authorities prefer to provide security while allowing witnesses to maintain their lives in their home communities. As federal operations prepared to transition to expanded investigation and long-term witness protection, Blake conducted final coordination with local law enforcement and federal agencies. Judge Thornfield, who had been processing his legal situation with obvious despair, approached Blake for final clarification. Assistant Director, what happens to this courthouse? Will federal oversight continue? Blake consulted federal judicial oversight protocols. Your Honor, the Department of Justice will implement permanent monitoring of courthouse operations to prevent future civil rights violations. Permanent monitoring? Federal authorities will establish liaison relationships with local court administration, implement civil rights training programs, and conduct periodic reviews of judicial procedures. What about my replacement? Prosecutor Santos reviewed federal judicial appointment protocols. Your Honor, judicial appointments will be subject to enhanced federal background investigation and civil rights compliance certification. As evening approached, federal operations began transitioning to long-term investigation and prosecution phases. Blake prepared for her departure from the community that had been her home for 18 months, knowing that her undercover identity as Madame Serafina was ending forever. Assistant Director Court Reporter Williams approached for final coordination. Thank you for protecting our community. I never imagined that routine court proceedings could uncover something this significant. Blake smiled with obvious warmth. Ms. Williams, your professional documentation was crucial to federal prosecution. Court reporters are essential partners in federal justice operations. Will we see you again? Ms. Williams, FBI protocol requires that undercover agents avoid extended contact with operational communities. However, federal victim services will provide ongoing coordination. As Blake gathered her federal materials and prepared to leave the courthouse, she took a final look at the community that had unknowingly become part of a major federal investigation. The briefcase that had contained her Madame Serafina materials was being replaced with FBI operational files that would be analyzed for months as federal authorities mapped the full scope of the criminal conspiracy. But as Blake walked toward the courthouse exit, her secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message that made her stop in her tracks. The message was brief, anonymous, and deeply disturbing. Operation Widow's Grief was just the beginning. The network extends higher than you imagine. Trust no one in federal oversight. The courthouse was compromised, but the real corruption is in Washington. Blake stared at the message with growing alarm. If the anonymous warning was accurate, the criminal network she had spent 18 months investigating might include federal officials responsible for overseeing her own investigation. Federal corruption at the highest levels would mean that witness protection protocols might be compromised, that evidence could be suppressed, and that the criminals she had worked to expose might escape justice through federal protection. As Blake considered the implications of the anonymous warning, she realized that Operation Widow's Grief had not concluded a criminal investigation. It had exposed the beginning of a conspiracy that might reach into the heart of federal law enforcement itself. The courthouse lights dimmed as federal operations concluded for the evening, but Blake remained standing in the shadows, analyzing the encrypted message and its potential implications. If federal oversight authorities were compromised, then every witness she had promised to protect might be in danger. The criminal network might have federal protection that superseded FBI authority. Blake forwarded the anonymous message to FBI headquarters with maximum encryption, knowing that the response she received might determine whether Operation Widow's Grief represented a victory for federal justice or the beginning of a much more dangerous investigation into corruption within federal law enforcement itself. As she finally walked away from the courthouse, Blake's mind was already calculating the next steps in what might become the most dangerous investigation of her federal career, an investigation that could expose criminal corruption within the very agencies responsible for protecting national security. The lock had clicked twice, but the door that opened led not to resolution but to questions that might threaten the foundation of federal justice itself. Behind her, the courthouse stood in darkness. But encrypted communications networks were carrying messages that suggested the criminal conspiracy was far from ended, and that the most dangerous revelations were yet to come.